She married into the richest family in America and lived long enough to watch it fall apart. The Vanderbilts once controlled the railroads, the money, and the future of the United States. Their name was power. Their wealth was untouchable. Their mansions looked eternal. But behind the glittering empire stood one woman history barely talks about. Alice Clay Vanderbilt didn't just witness unimaginable luxury. She watched fortunes evaporate, heirs self-destruct, and a dynasty quietly rot from the inside. She saw how America's greatest fortune was built, and she lived long enough to see exactly how it was destroyed. This isn't a story about money. It's a story about what money does to families, and by the time it ends, you'll understand why the House of Vanderbilt didn't collapse overnight. It bled out slowly, right in front of her eyes, in the middle of the 19th century, before America learned how to worship money properly. Cincinnati, Ohio was still deciding what it wanted to be. In 1845, it was neither frontier nor empire. It sat somewhere in between, balanced on the edge of the Ohio River, watching the nation stretch westward. Flatboats and steamboats crowded the docks. Pork barrels, timber, and grain moved through the city like blood through an artery. The air smelled of river water, coal smoke, and ambition. Cincinnati was growing fast, but it was not yet powerful enough to be arrogant. It was here, on November 11th, 1845, that Alice Clay Gwynn was born. She did not arrive into poverty, but she did not arrive into excess either. Her world was one of structure, law, religion, and reputation. The kind of world that believed the future could be shaped through discipline rather than spectacle. Her father, Abraham Evan Gwynn, was a lawyer, not a tycoon, not a man whose name dominated headlines, but a man whose authority came from words, documents, and the quiet enforcement of order. He belonged to that class of 19th century professionals who believed stability was the highest virtue a society could offer. Her mother, Rachel, came from firmer ground still. She was the daughter of Henry Collins Flagg, Jr., a prominent politician, newspaper editor, and former mayor of New Haven, Connecticut. Through him, Alice inherited something more enduring than money: lineage. Her ancestors had fought in the American Revolutionary War, and their legacy was spoken of not with prideful shouting, but with the calm certainty of people who assumed history belonged to them. This was not a childhood of indulgence. It was a childhood of expectations. From her earliest years, Alice was surrounded by adults who believed that who you were mattered more than what you owned. Reputation was currency. Faith was foundation. Education was obligation. These ideas would be etched into her long before she ever saw a Vanderbilt mansion or stepped into a ballroom glowing with electric light. Cincinnati itself mirrored that philosophy. It was a city built by restraint before it was overtaken by speed. Churches stood tall and solemn. Private homes emphasized symmetry and function over grandeur. Wealth existed, but it did not yet demand spectacle. The city had not learned how to perform its success. Alice grew up in this atmosphere, where progress was real, but still cautious, where men talked about railroads and industry in measured tones, not yet drunk on the idea of limitless expansion, where women were expected to cultivate virtue, grace, and moral authority within the home. Because the home was still believed to be the backbone of the nation, for a time, her life followed a predictable path. Then, abruptly, it did not. In 1855, when Alice was just 9 years old, her father died. There was no dramatic scandal, no financial collapse, no heroic last words, just absence, a quiet, devastating subtraction that altered the architecture of her childhood forever. In the 19th century, a father's death was not merely emotional, it was structural. It changed a family's gravity. It shifted the future. For Alice, it meant growing up too early, learning restraint before she learned freedom, silence before confidence. Her mother would remarry. The family would move. New influences would enter Alice's life. But something fundamental had already happened. She had learned. At a young age, that stability could disappear without warning. It was a lesson she would spend the rest of her life watching others fail to learn. At 9 years old, Alice Clay Gwynn could not have known that she would one day stand at the center of the richest dynasty America had ever produced. She could not have imagined electric gowns, 70-room mansions, or fortunes so large they lost meaning. But she had already learned the most important truth of all, that power does not announce itself loudly, and that what is built slowly can still be lost. After the death of Abraham Evan Gwynn, the house did not collapse, but it changed its sound. There was less conversation, less certainty. The routines continued, but now they carried weight. In mid-19th century America, widowhood was not a temporary condition. It was a social reclassification. Rachel Gwynn was no longer simply a wife managing a household. She was now responsible for preserving its dignity, its future, and its place in a world that did not pause for grief. For Alice, this meant growing up under observation. Every gesture mattered. Every word spoken in public echoed longer. The Gwynn name still carried respect, but it was no longer shielded by a living patriarch. Reputation, once inherited effortlessly, now had to be maintained. Rachel understood this instinctively. She had been raised in a political household where image and influence were carefully cultivated. Her father, Henry Collins Flagg Jr. He had lived his life in public view, as a mayor, an editor, a man whose opinions shaped others. He had taught his daughter that survival among the respectable classes depended not on emotion, but on control. And so Alice's childhood did not become softer after her father's death. It became sharper. Education intensified. Religion became structure rather than comfort. Alice was taught to read deeply, speak carefully, and listen more than she talked. Literature, scripture, and moral philosophy filled her days, not as decoration, but as armor. There was no talk of romance, no encouragement of frivolity. She was being prepared not for happiness, but for endurance. In 1861, when Alice was 15, her mother remarried. The man was Albert Matthews, a writer and journalist who published under the pen name Paul Seek. He was intelligent, articulate, and deeply embedded in the world of ideas. Unlike Abraham Gwynn, whose authority came from law and precedent, Matthews lived among words, arguments, and interpretation. He did not replace Alice's father, but he reshaped the household under Matthews' influence. The family leaned even further into intellectual refinement. Discussion replaced silence. Ideas were debated. The written word became central. Alice absorbed this quietly, developing a sharp internal life that few around her fully noticed. Not long after the marriage, the family made a decision that would quietly alter the trajectory of Alice's existence. They moved to New York City. At the time, New York was not yet the myth it would become, but it was changing fast, and it knew it. The city was assembling its elite, old money families, rising industrialists, financiers, and political power brokers were beginning to circle one another, measuring status, influence, and lineage. Churches, clubs, and drawing rooms were becoming arenas where social order was negotiated. To live in New York was to enter competition, whether one admitted it or not. For Alice, The move meant displacement and opportunity in equal measure. Cincinnati had been defined by steadiness. New York was defined by momentum. It rewarded visibility, ambition, and performance, even virtue. Here, had to be displayed correctly. Rachel and Albert Matthews understood this world well enough to prepare Alice for it. Her education became more deliberate. Music, art, etiquette, and religious instruction were refined to match the expectations of elite society. She was not trained to attract attention, but to withstand it. Alice entered this new environment without spectacle. She was not dazzling. She was not loud, but she possessed something rarer: composure. By the mid-1860s, as Alice approached adulthood, New York society was beginning to notice her, not as a curiosity, but as a presence. She was careful with her words, precise in her manners, and unmistakably serious. In a city increasingly intoxicated with display, restraint itself became a kind of power. Her anchor was St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church, an influential congregation on Park Avenue. It was more than a place of worship. It was a social nexus, a gathering point for families who believed moral authority justified economic dominance. Alice did not merely attend. She served, teaching Sunday school, participating quietly but consistently. She established herself as someone dependable, devout, and respectable. It was there, among sermons and hymns, beneath stained glass and quiet ambition, that Alice Clay Gwynn stepped fully into the world that would define her life. She did not yet know it, but the city had begun to watch her, and somewhere within those polished pews sat a family whose name was already reshaping America's future. A family whose fortune would one day swallow her life whole. By the time Alice Clay Gwynn reached her early 20s, New York had finished deciding what it wanted to be. It wanted to rule. The city was no longer content to be a port, a marketplace, or a meeting point. It was becoming a stage, one where wealth demanded visibility and power required recognition. Railroads stitched distant cities together. Telegraph wires carried information faster than conscience. Fortunes expanded beyond imagination, and those who possessed them began shaping not just markets, but society itself. Into this shifting world stepped Alice, quietly, deliberately, and without illusion. She did not mistake New York's elegance for virtue. Her upbringing had trained her to recognize the difference, where others chased attention. She practiced consistency, where others displayed wealth. She displayed order, in drawing rooms and church halls alike. She was noticed not because she demanded notice, but because she never embarrassed the space she occupied at St. Denis. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church. Alice became a familiar presence. The church stood as both sanctuary and signal. To belong there was to be seen as morally anchored and socially acceptable. Its congregation included bankers, industrialists, heirs, and political families, people who believed wealth required religious legitimacy to feel complete. Alice taught Sunday school with quiet authority. She listened more than she spoke. She did not flirt. She did not perform. In a city increasingly obsessed with display, her seriousness became disarming. It was here, in this carefully curated intersection of faith and influence, that Cornelius Vanderbilt II first noticed her. He was only 2 years her senior. But his life had been shaped by forces far larger than age. He was the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, known across the nation as the Commodore, a man whose empire of steamships and railroads was already redefining American capitalism. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had been raised with the knowledge that power awaited him. He did not need to chase opportunity. It had been assigned at birth. But with that certainty came expectation, discipline, obedience, and responsibility to a name that carried national weight. When Cornelius and Alice met, there was no dramatic collision, no scandal, no forbidden attraction, no rebellion. Their connection unfolded with the same restraint that defined both of them. Alice was not dazzled by his inheritance. She had been raised to treat wealth as circumstance, not character. Cornelius, in turn, found something rare in her, a woman who did not see his fortune as spectacle, nor his future as conquest. Their courtship was swift, but not careless. In elite 19th century society, speed did not imply recklessness, it implied approval. Families observed, churches noticed, conversations took place behind closed doors, and when no objections emerged, momentum followed. On February 4th, 1867, at just 21 years old, Alice married Cornelius Vanderbilt II with that ceremony. Her life crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. She did not merely marry a man, she married into a dynasty. From that moment forward, Alice Clay Gwynn ceased to exist in the public eye. In her place stood Alice Clay Vanderbilt, wife, future mother, and eventual matriarch of the most powerful family in America. The marriage tied her fate to wealth on a scale she could not yet fully comprehend. Railroads stretching across states, monopolies defended in courtrooms, fortunes calculated in sums so large they lost intimacy. Yet Alice did not celebrate. Those who knew her noticed something peculiar. She approached her new role not with excitement, but with preparation. She understood, perhaps better than anyone around her, that proximity to power did not guarantee security. Power could elevate, but it could also consume. As Alice stepped into the Vanderbilt world, she carried with her the lessons of Cincinnati, the discipline of widowhood, and the quiet awareness that stability was fragile, even when surrounded by gold. She was entering a family at the height of its ascent, and though she could not yet see the descent ahead, she would one day become the only one who remembered what it felt like before the fall began. Marriage had carried Alice Clay Vanderbilt across an invisible threshold, but long before she crossed into the Vanderbilt dynasty, another transformation had already begun shaping her. It started years earlier, after her father's death, when stability did not disappear, but reorganized itself around new rules. Albert Matthews entered Alice's life not as a rescuer, but as a force of redirection, a writer and journalist, known publicly by the pen name Paul Seek. Matthews belonged to a different species of authority than the men Alice had known before. He did not command through office or inheritance. He persuaded through ideas. Words were his tools, arguments his currency, in the Gwynn household. Conversation changed tone. Silence was no longer the default. Discussion, measured, articulate, and intentional, became the daily rhythm. Politics, religion, literature, and morality were not merely believed, they were examined. Alice absorbed this without resistance. She learned how belief could be framed, how opinion could be defended, how conviction could be expressed without spectacle. Matthews did not teach her ambition, but he sharpened her mind, quietly preparing her for a world where intellect could serve as both shield and weapon. Her education was deliberate and private, designed to refine rather than expand. Literature taught her empathy without sentimentality. Religious instruction emphasized discipline over emotion. Music and art were studied not for pleasure, but for fluency, tools of social navigation rather than personal indulgence. She was being trained for visibility without vulnerability. By the early 1860s, Alice had become something New York society valued deeply. Though rarely acknowledged openly, a woman who could move through elite spaces without disturbing them. When the family relocated to New York City, the timing was precise. The Civil War was reshaping the nation's moral and economic architecture. Industry was accelerating. Fortunes were being made not over generations, but within lifetimes. New York was absorbing wealth at a pace it had never experienced and struggling to impose order on it. Old families guarded their lineage, new fortunes demanded recognition, and between them lay tension, unspoken, constant, and competitive. Alice entered this environment with no illusions. She did not mistake the city's grandeur for unity. She saw how quickly admiration turned into judgment, how easily reputation could be elevated or destroyed. She observed how women were measured not only by beauty or charm, but by how well they reinforced the image of the men beside them. Her response was restraint. She did not attempt to dominate rooms. She did not pursue social conquest. Instead, she cultivated reliability. She became someone hosts trusted, churches valued, and elders approved of. In a city where novelty was prized, consistency became her signature. Nowhere was this more evident than at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church. The church functioned as both moral institution and social filter. Its congregation represented New York's aspirational elite, those who believed that wealth required moral legitimacy to be complete. Attendance was devotion, but also declaration. Alice did not attend to be seen. She attended to belong, teaching Sunday school. She demonstrated patience and seriousness. Her faith was neither performative nor loud. It was practiced, in an era when religious affiliation still shaped public trust. This mattered. By the mid-1860s, Alice had become quietly integrated into the city's upper circles, not as an ornament, but as a presence. People remembered her, not because she demanded attention, but because she never violated expectation. This was no accident. Alice had learned early that survival within systems of power required one essential skill: knowing when not to speak. And as New York continued to sharpen itself, turning wealth into spectacle and ambition into sport, Alice stood perfectly positioned at the edge of its transformation. She was prepared, she was composed, and she was about to be noticed by a family for whom restraint would never come naturally. The city had opened its doors to her. Soon, a far greater door would open, and once she crossed it, there would be no return. New York did not welcome newcomers gently. It assessed them. The city in the 1860s was expanding faster than its own traditions could contain. Wealth poured in from railroads, shipping, manufacturing, and finance. But social legitimacy lagged behind money. There were families who had arrived with pedigree but limited capital, and others who arrived with unimaginable fortunes but no accepted place among the elite. This imbalance created a silent, relentless pressure. Everyone was being measured. Alice understood this almost immediately. In Cincinnati, reputation had been inherited. In New York, it had to be performed, carefully, repeatedly, and without error. The city did not forgive missteps easily, especially from women. A single lapse in decorum could define a reputation for years. Alice responded not with fear, but with calibration. She learned the rhythms of the city, when to appear, when to withdraw, when to speak, and when silence carried more authority. She observed how drawing rooms functioned as unofficial courts, how churches doubled as registries of moral worth, how friendships were formed not out of affection, but alignment. New York society was not cruel. It was precise. Women, in particular, were expected to embody stability. Men could gamble, speculate, fail, and recover. Women were meant to represent continuity, moral, social, and emotional. They were the visible proof that wealth had not corrupted the household. Alice fit this role instinctively. She dressed with restraint. She spoke without excess. Her manner suggested confidence without ambition. She neither chased influence nor rejected it. Instead, she allowed it to settle around her naturally. This made her legible to the city. Hosts trusted her presence. Elders approved of her conduct. Clergy valued her devotion. In a world obsessed with advancement, Alice did something unusual. She made people feel safe. And safety, in an era of rapid change, was rare currency. As New York accelerated, so did its internal competition. Old families watched new fortunes rise with suspicion. Industrial wealth threatened to outpace inherited prestige. Social hierarchies hardened in response, becoming more exclusive even as money flooded in. Alice watched this unfold without commentary. She understood that power, when unsettled, becomes defensive. That families at the top were not merely wealthy, they were anxious. Their dominance depended on recognition as much as capital. This made them sensitive to outsiders who did not follow the rules. Alice followed them flawlessly. By the time she reached her early 20s, she had become quietly embedded within the city's respectable circles. Not famous, not discussed, but known. It was during this period that New York's institutions, churches, charities, and private social networks began to function as gateways. Entry was not formal, but it was decisive. Those who passed through gained access to marriages, alliances, and futures that were otherwise unreachable. St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church was one such gateway, situated on Park Avenue. It stood at the intersection of faith and influence. Its congregation represented a particular vision of American authority, wealth tempered by Protestant morality, power framed as responsibility. To be seen there regularly was to signal reliability. Alice did more than attend. She participated. Teaching Sunday school placed her in a role of trust. It suggested patience, discipline, and a willingness to serve rather than dominate. In an age when religious life still shaped public credibility, this mattered deeply. People began to associate Alice with steadiness. They noticed her consistency, her refusal to indulge in gossip, her ability to navigate social interactions without leaving damage behind. She was not remarkable in the theatrical sense, but she was dependable. And in New York, dependability was rare. By the mid-1860s, Alice Clay Gwynn had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer simply present in the city. She was recognized, not as an object of fascination, but as someone who belonged. This recognition did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, in invitations extended without explanation, in introductions made without hesitation, in the subtle assumption that Alice would be welcome wherever respectability mattered. She had passed the city's test, and having passed it, she stood unknowingly within reach of families whose names were already reshaping America's future. Families who sought not brilliance, but stability, not charm, but assurance. New York had measured her, and found her worthy of something far greater than she yet imagined. There are moments in history when power does not announce itself with spectacle, but with proximity. New York in the mid-1860s was full of such moments. The city's true negotiations did not always occur in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in quieter places, church aisles, charity committees, private parlors, where influence was measured not by volume, but by alignment. St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church was one of those places. To outsiders, it was simply a place of worship. To those who understood the city's inner mechanics, it was a sorting ground. Families did not merely pray there, they presented themselves. Attendance signaled values. Consistency suggested reliability. Participation implied legitimacy. Alice Clay Gwynn moved through this environment with an ease that was learned, not innate. She did not attempt to impress. She did not seek attention from the pulpit or prominence among congregants. Instead, she occupied her role, teaching, listening, serving, with an exactness that made her difficult to question. In a city growing intoxicated on excess, she represented something older, order. It was in this space, where wealth sought moral confirmation, that Cornelius Vanderbilt II became aware of her. Cornelius did not arrive at St. Bartholomew's as a seeker. He arrived as an heir. By then, the Vanderbilt name was already inseparable from American progress. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, had transformed transportation, first through steamships, then through railroads that tied distant regions into a single economic organism. His wealth was not abstract, it was visible in steel, coal, and motion. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had been raised with this knowledge as burden and inheritance. He was expected to embody continuity, to preserve, not reinvent, to represent a name that carried national consequence. He had been taught discipline early. Public behavior mattered. Associations mattered even more. When he noticed Alice, it was not because she stood out. It was because she did not. In a congregation filled with ambition disguised as humility, Alice's sincerity was unmistakable. She did not orbit powerful figures. She did not leverage proximity for advancement. Her presence suggested that she would remain the same regardless of who stood beside her. For a family like the Vanderbilts, new money by old-world standards, this quality was invaluable. Their fortune was vast. Their acceptance was not guaranteed. The early encounters between Alice and Cornelius unfolded without drama. There were no grand gestures, no public declarations. Their conversations were measured, their interactions restrained. Each observed the other with the quiet scrutiny common to families who understood that marriage was not merely personal, it was structural. Alice recognized Cornelius's position immediately, but she did not treat it as spectacle. Wealth, to her, was circumstance, not character. Cornelius, in turn, recognized in Alice a temperament that could survive proximity to immense power without being consumed by it. Their compatibility lay not in passion, but in alignment by the standards of elite society. Their courtship moved quickly, but speed did not imply recklessness. It implied consensus. Families spoke, reputations were weighed, churches observed, no objections surfaced. And so, on February 4th, 1867, Alice crossed another threshold. At 21 years old, she married Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The ceremony itself was proper, restrained, and deliberate, fitting for a union that carried implications far beyond affection. With that marriage, Alice entered not simply a family, but an institution. From that day forward, her life would be measured in different units. Her name changed, and with it, the expectations attached to her existence. She was no longer evaluated solely as Alice Clay Gwynn, daughter of Cincinnati respectability. She became Alice Clay Vanderbilt, tethered to a dynasty whose wealth reshaped cities and whose decisions rippled across the nation. The scale of what she had entered was not yet fully visible to her. The railroads, the monopolies, the generational fortune that dwarfed personal comprehension. But Alice did not step forward with awe. She stepped forward with caution. Those who observed her noticed something unusual. She approached her new role as if it were a responsibility rather than a reward. She did not seek to dominate society. She did not chase admiration. She prepared herself, mentally, morally, structurally, for what lay ahead. Because if Alice understood anything by then, it was this: power does not protect those who misunderstand it. She had entered the Vanderbilt world at the moment of its greatest ascent, and though no one could yet see the long arc of what was to come, Alice would one day become the living memory of a time before excess turned into erosion, before fortune, untethered from restraint, began its slow unraveling. Marriage, in the Vanderbilt world, was never merely a union between two people. It was a calculation. When Alice Clay Vanderbilt entered her new life in 1867, She did so with an acute awareness that her private self would now be inseparable from a public role. The Vanderbilt name carried weight across courtrooms, markets, and rail lines stretching from the Atlantic toward the interior of the continent. To marry into that name was to surrender anonymity forever. Yet Alice did not enter blindly. She had been raised to understand systems, family systems, moral systems, social systems, and the Vanderbilt dynasty was the largest and most unforgiving system she had ever encountered. It was governed by hierarchy, loyalty, and expectation. Affection mattered, but continuity mattered more. At the center of it all stood the Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt, still alive at the time of Alice's marriage. Though age had slowed him, his presence remained gravitational. His fortune was already legendary, his authority unquestioned. Entire industries bent around decisions he made in private rooms for Alice. The Commodore was not merely a relative by marriage, he was a force of nature. She observed him carefully. He embodied a version of American power that did not ask for permission. He had built his empire by moving faster, harder, and more ruthlessly than his rivals. Steamships, railroads, monopolies, each had been a battlefield, and he had emerged dominant from all of them. But the Commodore was also a man obsessed with control. He expected obedience. He valued discipline. And above all, he believed the family existed to preserve the empire, not the other way around. Alice understood this instinctively. She did not attempt to charm him. She did not attempt to impress. Instead, she demonstrated what mattered most to men like him: reliability. She followed protocol. She respected boundaries. She made herself useful without becoming visible. In doing so, she secured something more valuable than affection: acceptance. Her husband, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, occupied a complicated position within this structure. As the Commodore's grandson and heir to William Henry Vanderbilt, he lived under constant expectation. He was not expected to build the empire. That work had already been done. He was expected to maintain it. This distinction mattered. Builders are forgiven excess. Caretakers are not. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was serious, disciplined, and cautious by nature. He believed in order, in propriety, and in the preservation of what had been earned. In Alice, he found a partner who mirrored those instincts rather than challenged them. Their early married life was defined not by romance, but by coordination. They learned how to move together through society, how to present a united front, how to occupy spaces that were simultaneously domestic and political. Their household was expected to reflect stability, legitimacy, and restraint, especially as newer, flashier fortunes threatened to overshadow even the Vanderbilts. Children arrived quickly in elite 19th century families. Fertility was both personal and strategic. Heirs were not merely loved, they were necessary. Alice embraced motherhood with the same seriousness she applied to everything else. Her role was not decorative, it was foundational. She managed the household with precision: staff, schedules, appearances. Nothing was left to chance. The Vanderbilt home was not allowed to become chaotic, because chaos suggested weakness. But beneath this surface of order, the first fractures began to form. Wealth on such a scale distorted relationships. It altered expectations. It insulated children from consequence. Alice, perceptive and disciplined, noticed these effects early. She saw how privilege could dull urgency, how certainty could erode gratitude. She attempted to counter this, not with severity, but with structure. Religion remained central. Education was emphasized. Conduct was monitored. But money had a gravity of its own, and even Alice could not fully resist it. As the years passed, the Vanderbilt fortune continued to expand beyond comprehension. Railroads multiplied, profits soared. The family's influence extended into politics, finance, and urban development, and with each expansion, the expectations placed upon Alice grew heavier. She was no longer merely a wife or a mother. She was becoming something else entirely, a stabilizing presence within a family whose wealth threatened to outpace its wisdom. She had married into the most powerful dynasty in America at precisely the moment when power began to change its nature. What had once been earned through risk and effort was now inherited as certainty. Alice could sense the danger in that shift. She could not yet name it. She could not yet stop it. But she felt it, quietly, persistently, like a fault line forming beneath a perfectly constructed house. The marriage that had elevated her had also positioned her at the center of something fragile. And though the Vanderbilt empire still appeared unshakable, Alice had begun to understand a truth that history would later confirm: that the greatest threat to great fortunes is not external attack, but internal complacency. The Vanderbilt household expanded quickly, as great houses were expected to do, for Alice Clay Vanderbilt. Motherhood was not an accessory to wealth. It was its counterweight. Each child represented continuity, but also responsibility. In families where money insulated against consequence, children could drift. Alice refused to let that happen easily. There would be 7 children in all. Their arrival followed the rhythm expected of elite 19th century families: orderly, anticipated, and publicly celebrated. Yet behind the formal announcements and polite congratulations, Alice experienced motherhood not as spectacle, but as labor, emotional, moral, and constant. The first child, Alice Vanderbilt, was born in 1869. She was named after her mother, a symbolic act that suggested permanence and inheritance in a family obsessed with legacy. Names mattered. To name a child after oneself was to imagine a future in which continuity felt guaranteed. That future did not arrive. In 1874, at just 5 years old, young Alice died. The loss struck with quiet brutality. There was no public scandal, no extended mourning permitted beyond what decorum allowed. In elite society, grief was expected to be controlled, measured, and brief. Excessive sorrow suggested instability. Alice learned, once again, how to suffer silently. The death of a child did not pause the Vanderbilt machine. Life continued. Expectations remained. More heirs were required. And so the family pressed forward, as families of power always do. Their second child, William Henry Vanderbilt, named after Cornelius's father, seemed for a time to embody the promise of the dynasty: intelligent and well-educated. He was sent to Yale University, groomed for a future of responsibility and prominence. But in 892, during one of the last deadly outbreaks of typhoid fever in the United States, William Henry died in his early 20s. Another son lost, another future erased. For Alice, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Wealth could purchase doctors, tutors, protection, and comfort, but it could not purchase immunity. The Vanderbilt fortune, vast as it was, failed repeatedly at the one task Alice valued most: preserving her children. The surviving children grew up under this shadow. Cornelius Vanderbilt III, born in 1873, was the third eldest and perhaps the most defiant. Where his parents valued restraint, he leaned toward independence. Where the family demanded alignment, he pursued affection. His marriage to Grace Graham Wilson, the daughter of a New York banker, should have been acceptable by most standards, but it violated something deeper within the Vanderbilt hierarchy: control. The family disapproved, and when Cornelius III chose love over obedience, he paid the price. He was disinherited. The rupture was complete and lasting. Father and son never reconciled during Cornelius Vanderbilt II's lifetime. For Alice, this conflict was especially painful, not because she rejected her son's choice, but because she understood the cost of defiance within a dynasty built on obedience. The family did not bend, and so the lesson was reinforced. Belonging required submission. Not all of Alice's children resisted the structure. Gertrude Vanderbilt, the fourth child, channeled her privilege into creativity. She became an artist, eventually founding what would become the Whitney Museum of American Art in Gertrude. Alice saw a rare outcome: wealth used not to dominate, but to cultivate. The younger sons, Alfred Vanderbilt, born 1877, and Reginald Vanderbilt, born 1880, were positioned as principal heirs. Their lives unfolded with extraordinary advantage and extraordinary risk. They inherited not just money, but expectation, freedom, and insulation from consequence. Alice's final child, Gladys Vanderbilt, born in 1886, arrived when Alice was already in her early 40s. By then, motherhood was no longer new. It was weighted with memory. Gladys would later marry a Hungarian count in 1908, further entangling the Vanderbilt name with European aristocracy. From the outside, the Vanderbilt family appeared triumphant: 7 children, unimaginable wealth, national prominence. From the inside, Alice saw something else. She saw how inheritance distorted motivation, how privilege complicated character, how love, when entangled with expectation, became conditional. She loved her children fiercely, but she did not romanticize them. She understood that money, when inherited too easily, weakened the very qualities that had built it. Discipline softened, gratitude thinned, purpose blurred. Alice attempted to impose structure where she could. Religion remained central. Education was enforced. Conduct mattered. But the gravitational pull of wealth was stronger than any single will, even hers. As her children grew into adults, Alice began to recognize a sobering truth. The Vanderbilt fortune had grown too large for the family to hold it responsibly. What had once required vigilance now required restraint, and restraint was far harder to teach to those who had never known absence. She had given birth to heirs, but she was beginning to fear that the dynasty itself was becoming unteachable. By the late 1870s, the Vanderbilt name no longer needed explanation. It was spoken with a mixture of awe and resignation, an acknowledgement that certain forces in American life had grown too large to challenge directly. Railroads under Vanderbilt control stitched together cities, markets, and futures. Decisions made within the family reverberated far beyond private rooms. And yet, inside the Vanderbilt household, something subtle had begun to shift. The death of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, in 1877, marked the end of an era that no amount of money could revive. He left behind more than $100 million, a sum so vast it defied ordinary comprehension, equivalent to several $billion in modern terms. Despite having more than a dozen children, he left 95% of that fortune to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt. The message was unmistakable. Power was not shared, it was consolidated. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited not only wealth, but the obligation to preserve a monopoly. Unlike his father, he did not relish battle. He was not a builder by instinct. But the system he inherited was so dominant that it continued to grow almost automatically. When William Henry died in 1885, less than a decade after his father, the fortune had doubled to over $200 million. Once again, consolidation followed. The bulk of the estate passed to his 2 eldest surviving sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William Kissam Vanderbilt. For Alice, this moment represented a transformation that could not be undone. 18 years after her marriage, she and Cornelius were no longer simply wealthy. They had entered a category of existence that separated them from society entirely. Their resources exceeded personal need. Their influence exceeded accountability. They were, by any modern definition. Billionaires. With that elevation came isolation. Alice felt it immediately. Friends became cautious. Conversations shifted. People approached with deference rather than familiarity. In public spaces, the Vanderbilt name preceded her, reshaping interactions before she ever spoke. She had crossed from participation into symbolism. This transition did not excite Alice. It unsettled her. She had spent her life cultivating stability, believing that order created security. But the scale of this fortune introduced instability of a different kind. Too much wealth distorted judgment. It insulated behavior. It made mistakes survivable, and therefore repeatable. She saw it in her children. She saw it in extended family. She saw it in herself. If she was honest, the family's residences grew in scale and extravagance, but not in warmth. Homes became statements rather than shelters. Staff multiplied, distance increased. The household, once manageable, now resembled a small institution, and institutions. Alice knew, did not love. Despite this, Alice did not retreat. She assumed her role with quiet determination. If the Vanderbilt empire was to endure, it would need something beyond money. It would need coherence. It would need memory. It would need someone willing to say no, even when saying yes was easier. That responsibility fell to her. She did not issue commands. She set standards. She insisted on propriety, on religious observance, on education that extended beyond privilege. She attempted to anchor the family in principles that predated its wealth. But the challenge was immense. The family had outgrown its founding logic. What the Commodore had built through discipline and risk was now inherited as entitlement. The mechanisms that created the fortune no longer governed its use. Alice could feel the tension. The Vanderbilt empire still appeared flawless from the outside, its marble facades uncracked, its social dominance unchallenged. But beneath the surface, fault lines were forming. Children grew accustomed to indulgence. Heirs questioned authority. Money solved problems too quickly to allow lessons to take root. Alice stood at the center of it all, privileged, respected, and increasingly alone in her concern. She had become matriarch not by proclamation, but by endurance, and as the family ascended to heights no American dynasty had reached before, Alice carried a private certainty that history would eventually confirm, that no fortune, no matter how vast, could survive indefinitely without restraint. The Vanderbilts had reached the summit, and Alice, standing among them, could already sense the long descent that awaited. Not through collapse or scandal, but through quiet erosion, one generation at a time. By the early 1880s, the Vanderbilt family had become an institution unto itself. To the public, they represented permanence, an American dynasty so wealthy and entrenched that it seemed immune to time. Their name was spoken with certainty, as if it were a natural feature of the nation rather than the product of human ambition. Inside the family, however, permanence was an illusion Alice Clay Vanderbilt no longer trusted. She was now the mother of 7 children, each born into a world where limits were abstract and consequences negotiable. What had once been a household governed by discipline and expectation had expanded into something far harder to contain. Alice felt the weight of it daily. Motherhood, at this scale, was not intimate. It was managerial. Nannies, tutors, governesses, and servants filled the spaces where parents might otherwise stand. Children learned early that attention could be outsourced, that needs could be met by staff rather than sacrifice. Alice resisted this where she could. She insisted on routines, on shared meals when possible, on religious observance not as ceremony, but as habit, faith, to her, was not spectacle, it was structure. In a family surrounded by excess, structure was the only defense against drift. Yet even Alice understood that discipline competed poorly with inheritance. The Vanderbilt children did not grow up asking what was possible. They grew up asking what was permitted. Money had already answered every practical question before they learned to ask it themselves. The loss of their first daughter, Alice Vanderbilt, still hung quietly over the household. She had been born in 1869, a child meant to carry both her mother's name and the promise of continuity. Her death in 1874 had occurred quickly, without the prolonged drama society expected from public figures. But for Alice, the impact never faded. Grief, she learned, did not announce itself loudly in powerful families. It settled, it hardened, it altered behavior in subtle ways. After her daughter's death, Alice became more vigilant, not less. She watched her children closely, not for misbehavior alone, but for signs of emotional detachment. She feared not rebellion, but indifference. That fear deepened with the loss of William Henry Vanderbilt in 1892, though his death would come later. The seeds of that tragedy were planted early. William had been raised with expectation and promise, groomed for responsibility, educated at Yale University. He was meant to represent a bridge between generations, the proof that inheritance could coexist with competence. His illness and eventual death from typhoid fever would later confirm Alice's darkest suspicion, that wealth could surround a child with protection and still fail at the most basic task of preservation. But even before that loss, Alice sensed the imbalance growing. Her children did not share a single destiny. Each responded differently to privilege. Cornelius Vanderbilt III, serious yet restless, struggled under the weight of expectation. The family demanded obedience. He wanted autonomy. His eventual conflict with his parents would fracture the family permanently. But even in childhood, Alice saw the tension forming, an awareness that love in powerful families often came with conditions. Gertrude Vanderbilt, observant and inward-looking, gravitated toward art rather than authority. Alice recognized in her a rare instinct, the desire to create rather than consume. Gertrude's later achievements would stand apart from the family's financial legacy. But in these years, she was still forming, watching, absorbing, and quietly rejecting excess. The younger sons, Alfred and Reginald, grew up bathed in certainty. Their futures were assured long before they understood what assurance cost. Alice worried most about them, not because they lacked intelligence, but because nothing forced them to cultivate restraint. And then there was Gladys, the youngest, born when Alice herself had already lived long enough to understand how fragile certainty could be. Gladys arrived into a household already burdened with memory and loss. Alice loved her with a tenderness shaped by experience, knowing that late-born children often carried the unspoken hopes of their parents to the outside world. The Vanderbilt children were symbols of success, of abundance, of American promise. To Alice, they were evidence of a question she could not answer. How do you teach humility to children who have never known limits? How do you prepare heirs for responsibility when responsibility has never been required? She watched her family grow larger, wealthier, more secure, and felt a quiet dread beneath the marble floors and formal dinners. Because Alice understood something few around her would admit, that dynasties did not fail because of enemies. They failed because the next generation inherited power without learning why it had mattered in the first place. And in the Vanderbilt household, that lesson was becoming harder to teach with every passing year. In families where wealth is immense, Grief is expected to behave itself. It is allowed to appear briefly, contained, dignified, properly dressed, before being ushered away so that normal life can resume. Public mourning must never interrupt continuity. Private sorrow must never threaten order. Alice Clay Vanderbilt learned this rule early. She learned it again each time the rule failed her. The death of her first daughter had already taught her that money could not negotiate with fate. But it was the loss of William Henry Vanderbilt, years later, that made the truth unavoidable. William had been everything the family hoped for. He carried the right name. He followed the prescribed path. He showed promise without defiance. Educated at Yale University, he represented the future as the Vanderbilts preferred to imagine it: orderly, capable, and intact. His presence reassured those who feared that inheritance weakened character. He suggested continuity without chaos. Then he fell ill. Typhoid fever was no respecter of status. It moved through bodies with the same indifference whether those bodies slept in tenements or mansions. Doctors were summoned. The best care money could command was deployed without hesitation. None of it mattered. In 1892, William Henry Vanderbilt died in his early 20s. For the Vanderbilt family, the loss was destabilizing. For Alice, it was devastating in a way that could not be expressed publicly. A son who had done everything correctly, who had followed the rules, honored expectations, and accepted the burden of inheritance, was gone. There was no lesson to extract, no failure to correct, no one to blame. The family observed the rituals. Condolences arrived in carefully worded letters. Society acknowledged the tragedy with respectful distance. Then, as always, life moved forward. But Alice did not. She carried the loss with her into every decision that followed. She watched her remaining children differently now, less as heirs, more as fragile beings moving through a world that could not be controlled. No matter how much money surrounded them, the deaths created an imbalance within the family that could not be corrected. Surviving children absorbed the message in different ways. Some became cautious, some became reckless, some retreated inward, others tested boundaries with renewed urgency. Wealth magnified these responses rather than moderating them. For Cornelius Vanderbilt III, the losses reinforced his sense that obedience did not guarantee safety or approval. When he later chose to marry Grace Graham Wilson against his parents' wishes, he did so with full awareness of the consequences. The family's decision to disinherit him was not impulsive, it was corrective. The message was clear. Alignment mattered more than affection. Alice understood both sides of the conflict. She loved her son. She also understood the machinery of the dynasty he had defied. The rupture was permanent. Cornelius III and his father never reconciled. For Alice, the separation was a quiet wound, one that never healed because it was never acknowledged openly. Powerful families did not discuss fractures. They sealed them. Gertrude Vanderbilt, watching all of this, moved further into her own internal world. Art offered her distance from the family's emotional geometry. Creation allowed her to exist without needing approval from the system that governed her surname. Alice recognized Gertrude's withdrawal not as weakness, but as adaptation. The younger sons, Alfred and Reginald, responded differently. They grew up in the shadow of loss without absorbing its caution. For them, wealth still felt like insulation. Consequences seemed abstract, survivable, distant. Alice worried about this most of all. Loss had not humbled them. It had simply reminded them how unpredictable life could be. And unpredictability, when paired with vast resources, often produced excess rather than restraint. Through all of this, Alice remained composed. She did not indulge despair publicly. She did not alter the family's outward rhythm. She continued to host, to attend, to maintain appearances, but internally, something fundamental had shifted. She no longer believed the Vanderbilt fortune was protective. It was influential. It was vast. But it was not shelter. She began to understand her role differently. She was no longer merely preserving a household. She was bearing witness to the limits of power, to the cost of inheritance, to the truth that even the most disciplined lives could be undone by forces no ledger could record. Loss had stripped away illusion, and what remained was clarity, quiet, uncompromising, and isolating. Alice did not yet know how many more losses lay ahead, but she had learned enough to understand this. The dynasty she was helping raise would not be judged by what it accumulated, but by how it endured loss. And endurance, she was discovering, could not be inherited. By the end of the 19th century, the Vanderbilt family had grown beyond the scale of intimacy. What had once been a household was now an ecosystem, self-contained, heavily resourced, and increasingly impersonal. Decisions no longer passed through a single authority. Influence fragmented, responsibility diffused, and Alice Clay Vanderbilt stood at the center of it, holding together what no longer fit in human hands. The family's wealth had reached a point where it no longer clarified purpose. It obscured it. Problems were solved too quickly. Mistakes were absorbed without consequence. Comfort arrived before effort, and privilege arrived before identity. Alice saw this most clearly in the rhythms of daily life. Meals were formal affairs, governed by etiquette rather than connection. Children moved between tutors, governesses, and attendants. Learning competence but not cohesion. Conversations avoided discomfort. Conflict was deferred rather than resolved. Money smoothed everything, except meaning. The Vanderbilt children did not lack opportunity. They lacked friction in earlier generations. Ambition had been sharpened by uncertainty. The Commodore had built his empire through risk, competition, and relentless vigilance. Failure had been possible, and therefore instructive. For his grandchildren, failure was optional. Alice watched as her children matured into adults with unprecedented freedom and limited grounding. Their futures were assured, but their direction was not. Some drifted, others rebelled. Still others disappeared into indulgence so refined it passed for normalcy. This worried her more than open defiance. Rebellion could be confronted. Indifference could not. She attempted to counter this with principle. Religion remained a constant presence in the household, not as ornament, but as structure. Alice believed faith imposed limits that wealth refused to acknowledge. It reminded individuals that authority existed beyond money, that consequence was not always negotiable. But belief could not be forced. Her children attended services. They respected ritual. Yet for many of them, faith remained abstract, a language inherited rather than lived. Alice recognized the danger in this. When systems are inherited without belief, they become performance, and performance, once disconnected from conviction, collapses under pressure. The Vanderbilt family had reached a scale where love itself was conditional. Affection flowed easily when alignment was maintained. It withdrew when expectations were challenged. This was not cruelty. It was governance. But governance, Alice knew, was a poor substitute for connection. She found herself increasingly isolated in her concerns. Her husband, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was consumed by responsibility. Managing vast holdings required constant attention. The empire demanded vigilance, and he gave it willingly. like his father before him. He believed preservation was duty. Alice did not challenge this. She understood the necessity of his focus, but she also understood what it cost. The family's internal life became secondary to its external posture. Stability was maintained, but intimacy eroded. Everyone performed their role well, perhaps too well. By now, Alice had become more than a wife or mother. She was the family's memory. She remembered what life had been before certainty. She remembered restraint without abundance. She remembered a world where actions mattered because resources were finite. Her children did not share these memories. They had grown up inside the outcome, not the struggle. This asymmetry created a gap no inheritance could bridge. Alice tried, in small ways, to close it. She spoke of discipline rather than privilege, of obligation rather than entitlement, of legacy not as wealth, but as conduct. She reminded them, gently, persistently, that the Vanderbilt name carried expectations beyond comfort. Some listened, most did not, and Alice understood why. You cannot teach urgency to those who have never needed it. As the family expanded, through marriages, alliances, and offspring, the Vanderbilt name multiplied, spreading across households and continents. Each new branch diluted coherence further. Unity became symbolic rather than real. Alice felt this fragmentation deeply. She had entered the family when it was still consolidating power. She was now watching it disperse, not through collapse, not through scandal, but through excess. The Vanderbilt fortune was no longer held. It was being spent, distributed, absorbed into lifestyles that required constant replenishment. Estates multiplied, expectations inflated. The family's resources, once focused, now flowed outward in every direction. Alice could already sense the mathematics of the future. No fortune, however vast, could sustain unlimited dispersion indefinitely. And yet, no one wished to hear this. The family was too comfortable, too secure, too convinced of its permanence. Alice did not argue. She had learned that warnings issued too early are ignored. Instead, she watched. She remembered. She endured. She knew that when the reckoning came, it would not announce itself dramatically. There would be no single moment of collapse. There would only be the slow realization, generation by generation, that the certainty they had inherited no longer existed. And when that realization arrived, Alice would be there, not as a ruler, not as a savior, but as the last living witness to what the Vanderbilt dynasty had once been, before it grew too large to hold itself together, to understand what the Vanderbilt family became. Alice knew she had to remember, clearly and without sentiment, how it began. The name Vanderbilt had not always carried inevitability. It had once been precarious, earned through instinct, aggression, and an almost feral understanding of opportunity. At the center of that origin stood a man whose presence lingered long after his death, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore. Alice had married into the family while he was still alive, and though age had dulled his body, it had not softened his authority. He was not a figure of warmth or inspiration. He was a force, unyielding, unsentimental, and profoundly effective. The Commodore had risen from modest beginnings in the early 19th century, ferrying passengers between Manhattan and nearby ports in an age before bridges stitched the region together. Where others saw water as boundary, he saw it as leverage. When steamship technology emerged, he embraced it without hesitation, building fleets that outpaced competitors who clung to older methods. Speed was his advantage. Relentlessness was his weapon. By the time Alice was born in 1845, his ambition had already shifted inland. Railroads were the future, and the Commodore understood that whoever controlled movement would control markets. He poured his shipping fortune into rail lines that linked New York to the rising cities of the Midwest, Chicago, Cleveland, and beyond. He did not diversify for balance, he consolidated for dominance. By mid-century, the Vanderbilt Empire was less a business than an infrastructure. It moved people, goods, information, everything that mattered. Rivals did not compete so much as orbit, hoping to survive the gravitational pull. This was the foundation Alice inherited, and it was profoundly unstable in one crucial way. The Commodore had built his empire through personal vigilance. He trusted no system that did not answer directly to him. His wealth expanded because his attention never wavered. Every decision, every acquisition, every consolidation bore his fingerprint. When he died in 1877, leaving behind more than $100 million, the question was not whether the fortune would survive, but whether vigilance could be inherited. His will provided the answer. Despite fathering more than a dozen children, the Commodore left 95% of his estate to a single son, William Henry Vanderbilt. This was not favoritism, it was strategy. Fragmentation would weaken control. Consolidation would preserve it. Alice understood the logic immediately. Power, when divided too early, evaporates. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited not only the fortune, but the burden of proving he deserved it. Unlike his father, he did not relish confrontation. He was quieter, more restrained, less instinctively aggressive. But the empire he inherited was already engineered to grow. Railroads expanded, profits multiplied, legal frameworks bent to accommodate monopoly. The system rewarded itself. By the time William Henry died in 1885, less than a decade after his father, the fortune had doubled to over $200 million. Alice watched this escalation with unease. The speed at which wealth multiplied now far exceeded the family's capacity to govern it morally. What had once required mastery now required moderation, and moderation was not embedded in the system. When William Henry's estate passed primarily to his two eldest surviving sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William Kissam Vanderbilt, the final transformation occurred. Alice and her husband crossed into a realm of wealth that no longer functioned as resource. It functioned as environment. They were no longer rich within society. They were rich beyond it. From that moment on, the Vanderbilt fortune stopped being something that could be stewarded through attention alone. It demanded structure, restraint, and foresight on a scale no American family had yet mastered. Alice sensed this immediately. She had grown up in a world where money reinforced values. Now she lived in one where money threatened to replace them. The Commodore's shadow loomed large, not as guidance, but as warning. He had built something extraordinary, but he had built it around himself, and Alice, standing amid the abundance he left behind, could see the question history had not yet answered. What happens to an empire when its creator is gone, and only the inheritance remains? The Commodore's shadow still stretched across the Vanderbilt name. But shadows, Alice knew, did not hold structures upright. They only reminded you of what once stood there. When the Commodore died in 1877, the nation took notice, but it did not fully understand what had happened. Newspapers reported the number, over $100 million, even in an era already accustomed to vast fortunes. The sum defied scale. It was not simply wealth. It was dominance converted into currency. Adjusted for time, it would later be understood as the equivalent of several $billion. But the true shock was not the amount. It was the concentration. Despite having more than a dozen children, Cornelius Vanderbilt left 95% of his estate to one man, William Henry Vanderbilt. The rest were given comparatively symbolic sums, enough to ensure comfort, But not influence. There was outrage, whispered rather than shouted. Disapproval cloaked in politeness, but no legal challenge could succeed. The Commodore had designed his exit with the same precision he had applied to his businesses. The message was unmistakable. Power was not a family heirloom. It was an instrument, and it could not be trusted to many hands. Alice watched this unfold with careful attention. She had married into the family before this consolidation occurred. But now, she lived inside its consequence. What had once been a powerful dynasty became something closer to a private state. Resources centralized. Authority narrowed, and dissent rendered irrelevant. William Henry Vanderbilt became one of the most powerful men in America overnight. Unlike his father, he did not relish confrontation. He was not theatrical. He did not crave attention. But he understood the mechanics of monopoly well enough to preserve and expand what he had inherited. The railroads continued to grow. Profits compounded. Competition withered. William Henry did not need to innovate. He needed only to maintain momentum. The system was already optimized to reward itself. Legal frameworks bent easily around economic reality, and economic reality answered to the Vanderbilts. Alice observed this with unease. She understood that a fortune earned through vigilance could be preserved through caution, but a fortune that grew automatically risked escaping moral gravity. Money, once it multiplied faster than effort, ceased to teach discipline. The family's lifestyle adjusted accordingly. Residences grew grander. Staff expanded. Travel became routine rather than exceptional. The scale of daily life shifted upward so subtly that no single moment marked the change. Comfort crept in quietly, until it was assumed, and with assumption came entitlement. Alice felt the difference most sharply in conversation. Decisions were no longer framed around necessity. They were framed around preference. Costs were discussed as logistics, not limitations. The vocabulary of restraint faded, replaced by the language of convenience. When William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, less than 9 years after inheriting his father's fortune, the transformation completed itself. The estate he left behind had doubled, from $100 million to over $200 million. Alice did not celebrate. She understood that growth without governance was dangerous. That scale without meaning hollowed institutions from within. The wealth had outpaced the family's capacity to contextualize it. Once again, consolidation followed death. The majority of William Henry's fortune passed to his 2 eldest surviving sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Alice's husband, and William Kissam Vanderbilt. The next generation now stood at the helm of an empire larger than anything their grandfather had left behind. 18 years after her marriage, Alice found herself in a position no woman of her era had ever truly prepared for. She was no longer adjacent to power. She lived inside it. The family's resources were now so vast that they separated the Vanderbilts from society itself. Ordinary rules, social, financial, even moral, applied differently. Influence preceded explanation. Access replaced accountability. Alice sensed the danger immediately. Wealth on this scale demanded a counterforce, principle, restraint, memory. Without it, the fortune would not collapse dramatically. It would dissolve, spent, diluted, and scattered across generations too insulated to feel urgency. She began to see her role more clearly. She could not control the businesses. She could not dictate inheritance, but she could preserve standards. Alice leaned harder into discipline, faith, and conduct. She believed that if the family lost its moral grammar, No amount of money could restore coherence. She understood that the empire's survival depended less on markets than on character. Few around her shared this concern. The Vanderbilt name still commanded awe. Their wealth still appeared inexhaustible. The future still seemed guaranteed. But Alice, standing at the center of a fortune too large to argue with, felt the first unmistakable tremor of imbalance. The money had won. And when money wins without resistance, it begins, slowly, quietly, to forget why it mattered at all. By the late 1880s, the Vanderbilt family had crossed a boundary language had not yet learned to describe. There was no word for what they were. The term billionaire did not yet exist in common speech, but Alice Clay Vanderbilt understood the reality of it intuitively. The family's wealth had grown beyond comparison. It could no longer be measured against other fortunes because there were no longer meaningful peers. They were operating on a different plane. The inheritance that passed to Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William Kissam Vanderbilt did more than elevate their status. It altered their relationship to society. Ordinary distinctions dissolved. The difference between luxury and necessity blurred. Scale itself lost proportion. Alice felt this shift not in headlines, but in daily life. Requests arrived constantly, some subtle, others direct. Politicians sought favor. Institutions sought donations. Social leaders sought validation through proximity. Even criticism softened into negotiation. The Vanderbilt name carried leverage simply by existing. This concerned her deeply. When influence becomes ambient, when it surrounds you without effort, it stops being questioned. And unexamined power, Alice believed, was the most dangerous kind. She noticed how expectations changed. People no longer asked whether the Vanderbilts would contribute, attend, or intervene. They asked how much, how prominently, how soon. Participation was assumed. Declining became conspicuous. The family's residences reflected this new reality. Homes were no longer places of retreat. They were symbols, architectural assertions of permanence and authority. Rooms expanded, ceilings rose. Art filled walls not for love, but for legitimacy. Everything spoke the language of scale. Alice moved through these spaces with measured restraint. She had not grown up this way. She had learned order before abundance, principle before indulgence, and so she experienced the family's ascent not as triumph, but as exposure. The higher they climbed, the more visible their vulnerabilities became. Within the family, differences in temperament grew sharper. Some relatives embraced spectacle, others leaned into privacy. Some sought recognition through extravagance, others attempted invisibility. Wealth amplified every inclination, removing friction that might otherwise moderate behavior. Alice saw this clearly in her children. They were now adults, or approaching it, and the world met them with deference before they had earned self-knowledge. Their mistakes were softened, their excesses excused, their decisions insulated from consequence. Alice worried that the family had mistaken security for strength. The Commodore had built the empire by controlling movement, railroads, ships, logistics. Everything was governed by intention. But now the fortune moved on its own, flowing through accounts, properties, and expectations faster than anyone could direct it. Control had given way to momentum. Alice understood that momentum without guidance eventually ran out or turned destructive. She tried to intervene where she could. She encouraged philanthropy not as display, but as responsibility, giving. She believed should discipline wealth, not decorate it. She supported institutions that emphasized service, education, health, faith, rather than prestige alone, but philanthropy, too, risked becoming performance. The more the family gave, the more it was expected. Donations became a form of social currency, traded for influence and absolution, even generosity. Alice realized, could be corrupted by scale. Her husband, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, remained focused on stewardship. He was serious, dutiful, and committed to preserving the empire's integrity. But the demands placed upon him were relentless. The family's holdings required constant oversight. The system consumed attention. Alice did not blame him. She knew that empires demanded caretakers, not dreamers. But she also knew that caretaking without reflection led to exhaustion, and exhaustion led to compromise. Slowly, subtly, Alice began to withdraw from the illusion of control. She accepted that she could not govern the fortune. She could only model restraint within it. She could not prevent excess. She could only refuse to normalize it. This refusal set her apart. Others in the family chased novelty. Alice valued continuity. Others expanded outward. Alice held inward. She became, increasingly, a stabilizing reference point, a reminder of a time before wealth became atmosphere. She did not seek authority. Authority settled on her. People began to defer to her judgment in matters of propriety, conduct, and tradition. She became the family's internal compass, not because she demanded the role, but because she embodied consistency. Alice had become matriarch without proclamation, and as the Vanderbilt fortune reached heights no American family had ever known, she carried a quiet certainty that history would eventually test what they had built, not through external challenge, not through revolution or seizure, but through time. Time would ask whether inheritance could replace effort, whether scale could replace meaning, whether a fortune, once unmoored from discipline, could remember how it came into being. Alice did not yet know when that test would arrive, but she knew, with calm clarity, that it was coming. And when it did, the Vanderbilt name would no longer be judged by how much it possessed, but by how much it had learned to let go. In 1883, at the precise moment when New York society was redefining the meaning of excess, Alice and Cornelius Vanderbilt II began building a house that would say everything without explaining anything. It rose at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and West 57th Street, a location chosen not for convenience, but for dominance. Fifth Avenue was no longer merely a street, it was a declaration. To build there was to claim permanence in a city that was learning how to worship scale. The mansion was not designed to be lived in comfortably. It was designed to be understood. When completed, it became the largest private residence in New York City. Not one of the largest. The largest. Its size alone settled arguments before they could begin. The structure announced that the Vanderbilts were not participating in society. They were defining its upper limit. Inside, the rooms unfolded like statements of intent. A grand salon, a music room, and a conservatory occupied the first floor. Spaces meant not for intimacy, but for orchestration. The dining room, vast enough to double as an art gallery, blurred the line between nourishment and exhibition. Every surface, every ceiling, every corridor communicated the same message: abundance without apology. Alice walked through these rooms with composure. She did not mistake grandeur for belonging. She understood what the house represented and what it demanded. A residence of this scale was not shelter. It was obligation. It required hosting, performance, and constant visibility. It pulled its occupants into the center of social gravity, whether they wished it or not. For Alice, the mansion was both achievement and burden. She oversaw its operation with precision. Staff were managed, protocols enforced, appearances curated, A house of this magnitude could not afford disorder. Disorder suggested weakness, and weakness invited scrutiny. Yet even as the mansion solidified the Vanderbilt position, it exposed a deeper tension within New York society. Wealth alone was no longer enough. The city's elite were engaged in a quieter, more insidious competition, not over money, but over legitimacy. Old families guarded lineage, new fortunes demanded acceptance, and between them lay a battlefield of etiquette, invitation lists, and symbolic gestures. Alice was not obsessed with this war, but her sister-in-law, Alva Vanderbilt, was. Alva understood society as combat. She believed dominance had to be demonstrated publicly, relentlessly, and without hesitation. Her rivalry with Mrs. Caroline Astor, the unofficial gatekeeper of New York's old money, became legendary. Balls were weapons. Guest lists were ultimatums. Every social event carried strategic intent. Alice watched this from a distance. She did not compete with Alva. She did not challenge Mrs. Astor. She neither sought approval nor rejected it openly. Her power lay elsewhere, in restraint, consistency, and the refusal to be consumed by spectacle. But even Alice could not remain invisible forever. In March 1883, at one of Alva Vanderbilt's infamous masquerade balls, Alice stepped briefly into the center of attention and rewrote the rules of display in a single moment. She wore what would later be remembered as the electric light dress. The gown itself was white satin, elegant but not ostentatious, until the lights dimmed. Hidden wiring carried electrical current through the fabric. Glass beads, arranged like lightning bolts, caught the glow. The dress illuminated itself. It was not merely fashionable. It was symbolic. Electric lighting had only recently been installed in parts of New York City. It represented modernity, progress, and technological dominance, the very forces that had built the Vanderbilt fortune, by wearing electricity itself. Alice embodied the future while standing calmly inside it. The room fell silent. Newspapers seized the image. Society whispered. The moment became immortalized, not because it was loud, but because it was unexpected. Alice, known for restraint, had chosen audacity, but on her own terms, for one night. She eclipsed every rival without competing. Then she stepped back. The significance of the moment lingered long after the dress was packed away. It marked a shift in New York society. Parties became larger, more elaborate, more theatrical. The scale of expectation rose. The Vanderbilts were no longer merely participants in social life. They were its architects. Alice understood the cost. With every escalation, the margin for error shrank. Visibility intensified scrutiny. Grandeur invited imitation and resentment. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, the glowing dress, the carefully staged events all fed a system that demanded constant reinforcement. And Alice, standing at its center, felt the familiar tension return. The higher the family climbed, the less room there was to retreat. She had helped build a palace, not just of stone and marble, but of expectation, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that palaces did not age gently. They endured, they dominated, and eventually, they waited for time to catch up with them. After the mansion rose on Fifth Avenue, privacy became a myth. The Vanderbilt home was no longer a residence. It was a landmark. Carriages slowed as they passed. Pedestrians paused. Visitors invented reasons to walk the block. The house exerted gravity, pulling attention toward it whether invited or not. Alice felt this shift immediately. Before, wealth had allowed distance. Now it demanded exposure. The family's movements were noted, discussed, and interpreted. Silence was analyzed. Absence became a statement. Presence carried obligation. The mansion did not simply house the Vanderbilts, it framed them. Every dinner became an event, every gathering a signal. Who was invited and who was not was dissected in drawing rooms across Manhattan. The family's social calendar turned into a public document, its rhythms shaping the expectations of an entire class. Alice managed this with discipline. She understood that visibility, unmanaged, bred chaos. So she imposed structure. Invitations were deliberate. Appearances were spaced. Nothing was impulsive. The house ran on quiet protocol, invisible to outsiders but absolute within. Yet even perfect control had limits. New York society was changing faster than etiquette could stabilize it. Fortunes rose overnight. New names appeared with alarming confidence. The old hierarchies, once enforced by lineage and restraint, were eroding under the pressure of industrial wealth. The Vanderbilts sat at the center of this transformation. They were too rich to be ignored, too new to be fully accepted, and too powerful to be challenged directly. This ambiguity made them both admired and resented. Alice sensed the resentment more than the admiration. She saw it in the politeness that arrived a second too late, in compliments sharpened by comparison, in invitations extended with calculation rather than warmth. Wealth had elevated the family, but it had also isolated them, and isolation, Alice knew, was dangerous. It encouraged excess. It dulled empathy. It created echo chambers where approval replaced accountability. She worked against this instinctively. Alice insisted on restraint where others indulged. She limited the number of large events. She discouraged unnecessary display. She reminded her children and herself that attention was not validation, but the world did not share her discipline. As the 1890s approached, social competition intensified. Houses grew larger, parties more elaborate, dresses more theatrical. Each season demanded escalation. What had shocked one year became expected the next. The electric light dress had set a precedent Alice never intended. Innovation became obligation. She watched with concern as spectacle replaced substance. Society chased novelty without understanding why. Display became detached from meaning, a self-sustaining cycle of excess. Even philanthropy was drawn into this orbit. Charitable contributions were no longer quiet acts of service. They were announced, measured, compared. Giving became another arena of competition. Who gave more? Who gave publicly? Who gave strategically? Alice resisted this transformation. She supported institutions steadily and without fanfare. She avoided attaching her name where possible. She believed charity should relieve suffering, not inflate reputation, but anonymity was increasingly difficult. The Vanderbilt name carried too much weight. Even silence spoke loudly. Within her own household, Alice felt new pressures. Her children moved through a world that deferred to them automatically. Their opinions were solicited before they were fully formed. Their mistakes were softened. Their ambitions assumed noble by default. Alice worried that visibility had replaced effort. She spoke to them often, not with lectures, but with reminders. She emphasized conduct. She spoke of duty rather than privilege. She tried to anchor them to values that wealth could not provide. Some listened carefully. Others heard only the comfort surrounding them. Alice did not despair. She understood that lessons planted early sometimes took years to surface. She remained patient, consistent, unwavering. Her authority did not come from force. It came from presence, outside the family. The city watched closely. Newspapers chronicled every ball, every renovation, every rumored disagreement. The Vanderbilts had become characters in a narrative larger than themselves. Public fascination blurred into myth-making. Alice disliked this intensely. Myths simplified. They erased complexity. They replaced individuals with symbols. And symbols, once created, were difficult to escape. She began to feel the cost of being constantly interpreted. There was no room for uncertainty, no allowance for contradiction. The Vanderbilts were expected to embody wealth perfectly, confident, expansive, unquestioned. Alice knew the truth was quieter. The family was not invincible. The fortune, though vast, was not infinite. The structures that held it together required care, discipline, and humility, qualities that did not photograph well. Standing in the grand halls of the Fifth Avenue mansion, Alice sometimes felt the weight of its silence. The house had been built to impress, but it also absorbed. It absorbed expectations. It absorbed scrutiny. It absorbed the future. And Alice, moving through its corridors with measured steps, understood something few others did. Being seen was not power. Being understood was, and in a world obsessed with spectacle, understanding was becoming dangerously rare. From the outside, the Vanderbilt empire appeared flawless. The mansion stood immovable on Fifth Avenue. The family's name commanded instant deference. Their wealth seemed immune to fluctuation. To the public, the story was simple. Success had compounded into permanence. But Alice knew better. She had learned, through years of quiet observation, that structures built for display often hid the deepest fractures, and beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings, small fissures had begun to form. They did not announce themselves loudly. They appeared in habits, in expectations, in the slow erosion of restraint within the family. Differences that had once been moderated by scarcity now expanded unchecked. Personalities hardened, preferences became identities. Wealth magnified every divergence, turning minor disagreements into lasting separations. Alice saw it most clearly in how the family spent. Money no longer answered to purpose, it answered to desire. Estates multiplied, not because they were needed, but because they were possible. Renovations became cyclical, driven by fashion rather than function. Objects were acquired for distinction rather than meaning. Nothing was used until it was exhausted. This disturbed Alice deeply. She had been raised to believe that value came from care, that ownership implied responsibility. But in a world where replacement was effortless, responsibility lost urgency. Even time itself seemed to lose weight. Days blurred into seasons of social obligations, travel, and ceremonial events. There was little silence, little reflection. Constant motion dulled introspection. Alice felt herself resisting this rhythm. She carved out moments of stillness wherever possible. Early mornings, private reading, time spent in prayer. These became acts of defiance, not against wealth, but against distraction. She worried about the younger generations. They inherited not only money, but a tempo, one that moved too quickly for meaning to catch up. They were expected to perform confidence before they had formed conviction. Their lives were scripted before they understood the roles. Alice tried to intervene gently. She encouraged education not as ornament, but as discipline. She valued tutors who demanded effort over those who offered polish. She emphasized patience in a family accustomed to immediacy. But she also knew the limits of guidance. You cannot impose friction in a world designed to remove it. Beyond the family, the world was shifting. Industrial expansion continued, but so did its consequences. Cities swelled, labor tensions rose, inequality became visible, undeniable. While the Vanderbilts hosted grand dinners, others crowded into tenements only blocks away. Alice was not blind to this contrast. She supported charities addressing poverty, education, and health. But she understood that philanthropy could not erase structural imbalance. It could soothe symptoms, not resolve causes. And she feared that the growing distance between the wealthy and the rest of society would eventually demand a reckoning. Not violent, perhaps, but moral. The public fascination with wealth was already changing. Admiration began to share space with suspicion. Headlines praised success, but editorials questioned excess. The same visibility that had elevated the Vanderbilts now made them targets for scrutiny. Alice felt this shift before it became explicit. The tone of conversation changed. Jokes sharpened. Praise became conditional. Wealth was no longer celebrated uncritically. It was examined, measured, judged. She did not resent this. She believed scrutiny was healthy. What concerned her was the family's response. Some dismissed criticism as ignorance. Others retreated into insularity. A few leaned harder into display, mistaking defiance for strength. Alice chose a different path. She leaned into humility, not publicly, but personally. She believed example mattered more than declaration. That restraint, practiced consistently, could outlast spectacle. Still, the cracks widened. Marriages strained under expectation. Individual ambitions collided with family image. The weight of legacy pressed heavily, especially on those who had not chosen it. Alice saw how easily wealth could become burden. The marble halls echoed with footsteps, but also with silence, unspoken tensions, unresolved questions. Futures uncertain beneath polished certainty. Standing in the mansion one evening, Alice traced her hand along a cold stone column. It was beautiful, it was solid, and it was inflexible. She understood then that the greatest danger facing the Vanderbilt family was not loss of fortune. It was rigidity. An empire that could not bend would not need to be attacked. It would simply fail to adapt. The cracks were still small, still invisible to most. But Alice knew how structures behaved. Pressure did not announce itself. It accumulated, and when it finally demanded release, it chose the weakest point, not the most visible one. By the turn of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt name no longer belonged to a single household. It had become an expectation. Children were born into it without consent. They carried it before they understood language. Their futures were outlined in advance: education, marriage, residence, reputation, all pre-written by a fortune that had grown far larger than any individual will. Alice Clay Vanderbilt watched this with a mixture of pride and quiet concern. She had once believed inheritance was protection. Now she understood it was also pressure. The younger Vanderbilts grew up surrounded by certainty. Their paths were cleared before resistance could form. Doors opened automatically. Deference preceded dialogue. The world responded to them not as individuals, but as extensions of a name. Alice worried about what this removed. Struggle teaches proportion. Delay teaches patience. Limits teach judgment. The Vanderbilt children encountered none of these naturally. They were expected to excel, but rarely tested. Their education was meticulous, their tutors exceptional, their opportunities unmatched. Yet Alice sensed a growing disconnect between preparation and purpose. Knowledge without urgency drifted. She observed how ambition changed when failure was optional. Some children became cautious, fearful of disappointing an ideal they had not chosen. Others leaned into indulgence, seeking sensation where meaning was absent. Alice did not scold. She listened. She understood that rebellion, when it appeared, was not disrespect. It was resistance to invisibility. To be born into a legacy was to be seen constantly, yet rarely known. She tried to offer grounding where she could. She spoke of character as something built privately. She encouraged pursuits without spectators. She valued service over recognition. These lessons were not dramatic. They were repeated quietly, persistently, without guarantee of reception. Outside the family, America was changing. Industrialization accelerated. Cities expanded upward and outward. Immigrants arrived in waves, reshaping neighborhoods and labor markets. New fortunes rose with startling speed, challenging the old hierarchies that had once seemed permanent. The Vanderbilt name still commanded awe, but it no longer stood alone. Alice recognized this as inevitable. No position remained singular forever. She sensed that the family's greatest challenge would not be competition from others, but adaptation to a world that no longer revolved around inherited dominance. Some relatives embraced this shift enthusiastically. They invested, diversified, explored new industries. Others clung to tradition, convinced that scale alone guaranteed relevance. Alice stood between these instincts. She believed adaptation was necessary, but only if anchored by principle, change without reflection. She knew, led to erosion rather than renewal. As matriarch, her influence was subtle but steady. She became a mediator, a stabilizer, a presence consulted when tensions rose. Her authority did not come from control, but from trust earned over decades of consistency. Yet even she could feel the strain. The family had grown too large for intimacy. Decisions multiplied, interests diverged. The sense of shared direction weakened as each branch pursued its own interpretation of success. Alice began to feel the limits of her role. No single figure could hold together a dynasty of this scale indefinitely. The Commodore had done it through force of will. Alice relied on example and memory, but memory faded with distance. She felt time pressing. Her children were aging, her grandchildren coming of age in a world utterly different from the one that had formed the fortune they inherited. The values that had once ensured survival now seemed abstract to them. Alice feared that inheritance had become narrative rather than experience. Stories of struggle, when untested, risked becoming myth, and myths, once unmoored from reality, offered little guidance. She resolved to preserve what she could. Not the money, not the properties, but the idea that wealth was a responsibility, not an identity. She knew this idea would not triumph easily, but she believed it mattered. As the Vanderbilt name entered a new century, Alice stood quietly at the threshold, aware that the family's future would be shaped less by what they possessed than by how they understood the weight of having it. And weight, she knew, was something no inheritance could ever lighten on its own. For the younger Vanderbilts, the family name arrived in every room before they did. Teachers adjusted their expectations, classmates recalibrated their behavior, strangers offered deference without introduction. The name operated like a credential, unearned, unquestioned, and impossible to set aside. Alice saw how this shaped them. Confidence came early, but it was brittle. Praise arrived before achievement. Criticism softened into suggestion. The world treated them as conclusions rather than questions. She worried that certainty, when inherited too soon, prevented growth. In private conversations, Alice encouraged her children and grandchildren to separate who they were from what they represented. She urged them to build skills that could stand without the family's protection, to pursue competence quietly, without announcement. Some understood, others nodded politely and moved on. The problem was not arrogance, it was distortion. When every interaction is filtered through privilege, reality bends, feedback becomes unreliable, consequences arrive late, if at all. Even failure loses clarity. It becomes temporary, reversible, inconsequential. Alice recognized this as the most dangerous inheritance of all. The family's internal culture shifted accordingly. Achievement was assumed rather than celebrated. Expectations were high but vague. Success was measured against comfort, not effort. The Vanderbilt children were encouraged to be exceptional, but rarely taught how to evaluate themselves honestly. Alice tried to supply what the environment lacked. She valued discipline over brilliance. She praised persistence more than talent. She spoke often about work, not as obligation, but as grounding. Work, she believed, connected intention to outcome in a way wealth could not interrupt. Yet she could not rewrite the world they inhabited, outside the family. The name Vanderbilt had become shorthand for an era. Journalists used it as symbol. Social critics invoked it as evidence. Artists caricatured it. The family no longer controlled its own meaning. Alice found this unsettling. A name, once detached from the individuals who carried it, became abstraction. And abstractions were easily judged, reshaped, or discarded. She noticed how conversations changed when the name was spoken. Assumptions hardened, motives were assigned. Individual actions were interpreted as representative rather than personal. One Vanderbilt's excess became the family's excess. One mistake echoed across generations. Alice felt the unfairness of this, but she also understood its inevitability. Visibility demanded representation. As the family expanded, maintaining coherence became harder. Each branch lived differently. Values diverged. Some embraced extravagance openly. Others retreated into privacy. The public, however, saw only a single silhouette. This mismatch created tension. Alice often found herself defending relatives she did not fully understand, explaining choices she would not have made, absorbing criticism meant for a collective too diffuse to answer for itself. She bore this quietly. She believed that absorbing pressure was part of leadership, even when that leadership was informal, unacknowledged, and unpaid. But the strain showed. Alice aged gracefully, but the weight of expectation etched itself into her routines. She grew more selective with her energy, more deliberate with her words. She understood that her influence depended on steadiness, not intensity. She also understood that her time was finite. The family was entering a phase she would not fully witness, a future shaped by forces she could sense but not control. New industries, new social movements, new attitudes toward wealth and power. The Vanderbilt name would survive, but its meaning would change. Alice's greatest fear was not decline. It was misunderstanding. That future generations would inherit wealth without inheriting context, that they would confuse comfort for achievement, visibility for purpose, privilege for permanence. She began to document more: letters, reflections, advice offered not as instruction, but as record. She wanted to leave behind not rules, but perspective, a map of how the fortune had been lived from the inside. She knew few would read these carefully, but she believed that even a small trace of intention could matter late in life. Alice often reflected on the paradox she had lived inside. The Vanderbilt name opened every door, but it also closed off simplicity. It offered protection, but it removed anonymity. It promised security, but it demanded representation. She had learned to navigate these contradictions with restraint rather than rebellion, with presence rather than proclamation. And as the family moved deeper into the 20th century, Alice understood one final truth: a name that speaks before you do can carry you far, but it can never tell the world who you truly are. That task, she knew, remained painfully and privately individual. As the Vanderbilt children grew into adulthood, Alice began to notice a subtle but decisive shift. The legacy that had once offered direction was beginning to constrain. What had started as inheritance now behaved like architecture, solid, imposing, and difficult to escape. Expectations were no longer suggestions, they were boundaries. The family name outlined where one could go, what one could attempt, and how far deviation would be tolerated. Alice saw how this affected choice. Marriages were evaluated less for affection than for alignment. Careers were measured against reputation rather than inclination. Even personal interests were filtered through the question of how they reflected on the family as a whole. Freedom existed, but only within approved corridors. This did not produce rebellion immediately. It produced hesitation. Some family members delayed decisions endlessly, afraid of choosing wrong. Others committed early, not out of conviction, but to end scrutiny. A few rejected the framework entirely, withdrawing into indulgence or obscurity. Alice understood all three responses. When identity is inherited, self-definition becomes risky. She tried to speak openly about this in private conversations. She reminded her children that legacy was meant to support, not dictate, that the fortune had been built to enable lives, not script them, that the Commodore's success came from defiance of expectation, not submission to it, but history, once polished into legend, lost its rough edges. The struggle that had shaped the empire was now retold as inevitability. Risk was reframed as destiny. Effort faded behind outcome. Alice worried that this narrative imprisoned them. If success was inevitable, then failure became unforgivable. If wealth was destiny, then deviation became betrayal. She watched as pressure replaced curiosity. Within the family, silence grew around dissatisfaction. Discomfort was smoothed over with money, travel, and distraction. Problems were postponed rather than confronted. The machinery of privilege excelled at delay. Alice resisted this instinct. She believed discomfort was instructive, that tension, when acknowledged, could clarify values. She encouraged honest conversation, even when it unsettled social harmony. This made her unpopular at times. Truth rarely felt gracious when it interrupted comfort. But Alice had lived long enough to understand that comfort, when protected at all costs, exacted its own price. Outside the family, the world's relationship with wealth was changing again. The early 20th century brought reform movements, labor organization, and growing skepticism toward concentrated power. Newspapers that once celebrated industrial titans now questioned their influence. Public opinion shifted from awe to examination. The Vanderbilt name, once untouchable, became discussable. Alice welcomed this more than others did. She believed accountability was healthy, that power unexamined decayed, that criticism, even when imperfect, forced reflection. But many within the family felt threatened. They retreated into defensiveness. They framed scrutiny as envy or ignorance. They clung tighter to tradition, mistaking resistance for preservation. Alice saw the danger. A legacy that could not adapt would harden into caricature. She tried to model a different response. She listened more than she spoke. She acknowledged criticism where it was fair. She refused to pretend the family's wealth existed in isolation from the society around it. This did not diminish her loyalty. It deepened it. She believed loving something meant seeing it clearly, not protecting it from reality. As the years passed, Alice felt her influence shifting. She was still respected, still consulted, but the family no longer revolved around her presence. New voices rose. New priorities asserted themselves. The dynasty, like all living systems, was evolving beyond its original center. Alice accepted this without bitterness. She had never sought permanence, only coherence. She understood that her role had been transitional, a bridge between the raw ambition of the past and the uncertain complexity of the future. Bridges were not destinations. They existed to be crossed. In quiet moments, Alice reflected on what remained. The fortune would endure for a time. The properties would change hands. The name would persist, invoked, interpreted, repurposed. What mattered was whether the values she had tried to embody, restraint, responsibility, humility, would survive without her. She knew the answer was uncertain, but she also knew that legacies were not preserved by force. They survived when someone, somewhere, chose to live them again, voluntarily, imperfectly, and without guarantee of recognition. As Alice Clay Vanderbilt moved gently toward the later years of her life, she understood one final truth with clarity that brought her peace. A legacy becomes a cage only when it is mistaken for identity and freedom, even inside great wealth. Still began the same way it always had, with the courage to decide who you were, even when the world expected something else. There was no single year when the Vanderbilt empire began to fall. No crash, no scandal, no dramatic unraveling. What began instead was something far quieter and far more dangerous: dispersion. By the early 20th century, the Vanderbilt fortune was no longer concentrated enough to command obedience, yet still vast enough to erase urgency. The balance that had once preserved power, focus paired with restraint, had dissolved. Alice Clay Vanderbilt sensed this long before numbers confirmed it. The family had become wealthy in a way that no longer required coordination. Individual branches operated independently, drawing from a shared legacy but contributing little back to a common direction. What had once been an empire with a center was now an archipelago, connected by name, separated by intention. Money flowed outward, not recklessly, not foolishly, but endlessly. Each generation built estates, supported households, maintained lifestyles calibrated not to income, but to expectation. The fortune was not being squandered, it was being normalized, and normalization was irreversible. Alice understood the mathematics instinctively. No fortune, no matter how vast, could sustain infinite multiplication of dependence without reinvention. Wealth preserved through consolidation required discipline. Wealth distributed without regeneration thinned quietly, invisibly, until one day it no longer dominated. The family did not notice. Why would they? Comfort remained intact. Properties stood, servants arrived on time, investments yielded returns. There was no felt deprivation, only a subtle shift from abundance to maintenance. Alice saw the difference. Maintenance required defense. Abundance allowed creation. The Vanderbilts had crossed that line. The businesses that had built the fortune, railroads, shipping, infrastructure, were no longer personally governed by family members with obsessive control. Professional managers replaced personal vigilance. Dividends replaced dominance. The empire had become passive. This was not failure. It was evolution. But evolution without intention. Alice watched as attention drifted away from enterprise and toward lifestyle. The family still owned wealth, but it no longer produced vision. Investments were conservative. Risk was avoided. Innovation was admired from a distance. Safety became the priority. Safety, Alice knew, was expensive. She remembered the Commodore's appetite for risk. Not recklessness, but engagement. He had lived inside uncertainty and bent it to his will. The current generation lived insulated from uncertainty, observing change rather than shaping it. This worried her more than extravagance ever had. Extravagance could be corrected. Disengagement could not. Within the family, discussions of money grew less precise. Numbers were abstracted. Wealth became assumption rather than strategy. Decisions were made to preserve comfort, not to extend relevance. Alice saw the signs clearly. When money stopped being discussed openly, it stopped being understood. The family had entered a phase where wealth was inherited without comprehension. Its origins were known only as story, its mechanics invisible, its limits unimagined. Alice attempted to intervene. She encouraged younger family members to involve themselves in business affairs, not as figureheads, but as learners. She spoke of responsibility beyond enjoyment. She warned gently that fortunes required stewardship, not admiration. Some listened politely, few acted. The world, after all, had taught them a different lesson. The Vanderbilt name still opened doors. Their resources still exceeded imagination. There was no immediate penalty for inattention, no external force demanding adaptation. The decline, when it came, would not announce itself. It would arrive as a series of reasonable decisions. Another estate purchased, another household supported, another generation divided. Each step defensible, each step irreversible. Alice felt a growing sense of solitude in her clarity. She had lived long enough to recognize patterns. Empires did not fall from attack alone. They dissolved from comfort. They weakened not when challenged, but when unquestioned. She did not speak dramatically. She did not predict catastrophe. She simply watched, with the calm awareness of someone who understands that history moves slowly and that the most consequential shifts are rarely visible in the moment. As the Vanderbilt family entered this new phase, neither rising nor collapsing, but drifting, Alice understood something that few around her did. The end of dominance does not look like failure. It looks like normal life, lived very well, for a little too long. As the years passed, Alice noticed something unsettling. No one could clearly answer a simple question anymore. Who was in charge of the Vanderbilt fortune? Once. The answer had been obvious. First the Commodore, then William Henry, then Cornelius Vanderbilt II. Each era had a center of gravity. Decisions flowed outward from a single will, a single vision. Even disagreements had a focal point. Power, though immense, had been legible. Now it was not. Committees replaced authority. Advisors replaced conviction. Inheritance replaced intention. The fortune existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Alice saw how this diffusion changed behavior. Without a clear steward, responsibility became optional. Each branch of the family assumed another was watching the whole. Each individual optimized for personal comfort, trusting that the system would absorb the cost. And it did, quietly. Trust funds grew. Allowances adjusted, expenses normalized. Nothing broke. Nothing failed. Nothing demanded reform. That was the danger. The Vanderbilt wealth had entered a phase where it no longer commanded discipline. It enabled avoidance. Alice understood that systems without centers inevitably drift, without someone willing to say no, to expansion, to indulgence, to dilution. Wealth lost shape. It became soft, malleable, and eventually indistinct. She watched this happen in real time. Properties passed between generations with less emotional attachment. Estates that once symbolized achievement became logistical burdens, maintained out of habit rather than pride. Decisions about selling or keeping them were framed as convenience, not legacy. Alice felt the difference keenly. The family was no longer building monuments. They were maintaining inventories. This shift affected identity. Younger Vanderbilts spoke of the fortune as something abstract, numbers managed by others, outcomes guaranteed by structure. They trusted the system without understanding it. Confidence replaced curiosity. Alice worried that this trust was misplaced. Systems survived only as long as the assumptions beneath them held. Railroads faced regulation. Markets fluctuated. New industries emerged. What had once been unassailable infrastructure was becoming legacy capital. Stable, but no longer dominant. The family had not failed to adapt. They had chosen not to engage. Engagement required risk. Risk threatened comfort, and comfort had become the unspoken priority. Alice reflected often on the irony. The Commodore had built the fortune by refusing comfort. His descendants preserved it by prioritizing comfort above all else. The logic was understandable. The consequence was not. Within family gatherings, Alice sensed a subtle shift in tone. Conversations revolved around travel, renovations, social obligations. Business discussions felt distant, delegated, technical. No one spoke with urgency. No one spoke with hunger. The language of ambition had faded. Alice did not romanticize struggle, but she understood its function. Struggle clarified values. It forced choices. It made success meaningful because failure was possible. In the Vanderbilt world, failure had become theoretical. This made success hollow. She tried to convey this gently. She told stories, not as lessons, but as recollections. She spoke of uncertainty, of risk, of decisions made without guarantees. She wanted the younger generations to feel history, not just inherit it. Some listened with interest. Others listened with nostalgia. Few felt compelled to act. Alice accepted this with quiet resignation. She knew that influence diminished as memory became distant. The lived experience of scarcity could not be transmitted fully through words. It had to be encountered, and encounter, she feared, would come too late. As Alice aged, her role shifted once more. She became less a guide and more a witness. She observed how the family's wealth, once sharply defined, now flowed around obstacles rather than shaping them. How the Vanderbilt name still opened doors, but no longer determined outcomes. This was not tragedy. It was transition. But transitions, Alice knew, required awareness to navigate well. Without it, they became declines disguised as continuity. One evening, sitting quietly in a familiar room, Alice realized something with unexpected clarity. The Vanderbilt fortune had survived its founders. It had survived expansion. It had even survived excess. What it might not survive was irrelevance, not because it disappeared, but because it ceased to matter. Wealth without purpose did not collapse. It faded into the background. And as the family continued living comfortably inside that fading, Alice understood that history would not remember the moment dominance ended. It would only remember that one day, the name stopped carrying weight, and no one could say exactly when. By the second decade of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt family lived inside a paradox few of them could articulate. They had everything, and nothing demanded them. The fortune still existed in staggering sums. The residences still stood. The names still opened doors. But the pressure that once shaped behavior, the sharp edge that forced decision and discipline, had dulled. Comfort had replaced urgency. Alice Clay Vanderbilt felt this shift with a clarity that bordered on grief. She had lived through eras when wealth was earned through vigilance, preserved through restraint, and defended through constant attention. Now she lived in a time when wealth functioned like air, always present, rarely noticed, assumed to be permanent. And permanence, she knew, was an illusion. The family's financial structures had grown sophisticated, layered, professionalized. Trusts, boards, advisors, and legal frameworks insulated individuals from consequence. These mechanisms were effective, but they also removed intimacy. No one felt the fortune anymore. Decisions were abstracted into reports and summaries. Risk was outsourced. Responsibility diffused. Each generation inherited security without inheriting stewardship. Alice recognized the cost immediately. When no one felt responsible, no one felt compelled. The younger Vanderbilts spoke fluently about culture, travel, and refinement. They moved comfortably through Europe. They collected art. They supported causes. But few spoke with conviction about building something new. Creation had given way to curation. Alice did not dismiss these pursuits. They had value. But she understood that a family sustained by inheritance alone eventually lost its internal engine. The Commodore had been relentless because he had to be. William Henry had been disciplined because he chose to be. The current generation was careful because it was comfortable. Carefulness, Alice knew, did not generate momentum. She saw this reflected in how time was spent. Days were full, but rarely demanding. Schedules were crowded with engagements that required presence but not effort. Social obligations multiplied. Travel blurred into routine. Even philanthropy followed predictable cycles. There was motion everywhere, but little direction. Alice felt increasingly like a visitor in a house she had once helped anchor. The conversations around her assumed continuity. Plans extended indefinitely into the future. There was no language for loss, only for adjustment. The idea that the fortune might someday not dominate felt impolite to mention. So Alice did not mention it. She had learned that warnings spoken too late sounded like bitterness. And she had no desire to be remembered as resistant to change. Instead, she focused on what she could still influence. She emphasized humility. She praised effort when she saw it. She supported those who sought substance over display. Quietly, selectively, without expectation of return. She believed that even if the family as a whole drifted, individual lives could still choose meaning. That legacy did not have to be collective to matter. As her health began to wane, Alice became more reflective. She looked back not on what had been built, but on what had been felt. The moments of tension, the periods of uncertainty, the discipline that came from knowing nothing was guaranteed. Those experiences had shaped her more than abundance ever could. She wondered what would shape the generations to come. Would they learn through gradual erosion or through sudden correction? Would they adapt gently or only when forced by loss? She did not know. What she did know was this: the Vanderbilt fortune would not vanish overnight. It would not collapse under scandal or revolution. It would simply spread thinner with each generation, absorbed into lives of comfort until it no longer stood apart. And when that happened, no one would mourn loudly, because nothing obvious would have been taken away. Alice felt a strange peace in this realization. Empires were not meant to last forever. They existed to answer the needs of their time. The Vanderbilt fortune had done that, spectacularly. It had shaped cities, industries, and social structures. Its fading would not erase its impact, but it would end its dominance. As Alice Clay Vanderbilt approached the final years of her life, she understood that her role had never been to preserve power indefinitely. It had been to witness it clearly, to understand its rise, to live inside its excess, to recognize its limits. And in that understanding, she found something wealth could never provide: perspective. By the time the world crossed into the 1920s, Alice Clay Vanderbilt understood that she belonged to a vanishing category. She was among the last Vanderbilts who remembered before the fortune became abstract, before wealth became environment, before comfort replaced consequence. The younger generations knew the story, but they had not lived its pressure. They knew the names, the figures, the legends. But legend, Alice knew, was a poor substitute for experience. Memory fades faster than money. Alice felt this most acutely during family gatherings. The rooms were full. Laughter traveled easily. Conversations were polished, intelligent, effortless, but beneath the elegance, something essential was missing: urgency. No one spoke as if something were at stake. They spoke as if continuity were guaranteed. Alice did not interrupt them. She had learned that wisdom offered too insistently became background noise. Instead, she listened, attentively, patiently, absorbing the rhythms of a generation shaped by certainty rather than struggle. They were not careless. They were not foolish. They were simply insulated. The Vanderbilt name still commanded respect, but the world had changed its relationship with power. New fortunes rose from oil, automobiles, finance, and entertainment. Influence diversified. No single family dominated the American imagination the way the Vanderbilts once had. Alice saw this clearly. What had once been exceptional was now part of a broader landscape of wealth. The Vanderbilts were still rich, but they were no longer singular. And singularity, once lost, never returned. She noticed how the younger family members responded to this shift. Some welcomed it. They enjoyed anonymity within abundance. They lived well without carrying the burden of representation as heavily. Others felt disoriented, unsure how to define themselves without automatic prominence. Alice recognized both responses as rational, when identity had been shaped by inheritance. Losing its sharp edges felt like loss, even when nothing tangible disappeared. She thought often of the Commodore, not as myth, but as man. She remembered his impatience, his bluntness, his refusal to indulge comfort when opportunity demanded action. He had not sought admiration, he had sought leverage. The current generation sought balance instead. Balance was admirable, but it did not build empires. Alice understood that the age of empire-building dynasties was ending. The modern world favored institutions over individuals, systems over personalities. The very forces that had allowed the Vanderbilts to rise were now dispersing power more evenly. This was progress, but progress carried consequences. Families that rose through concentration struggled to adapt to diffusion. What had once been advantage became inertia. Alice did not mourn this intellectually. She accepted it as historical gravity. What she mourned quietly was the loss of memory, the tactile understanding of what it had taken to build everything now taken for granted. She worried that when the last witnesses were gone, the fortune would become untethered from its origins entirely, that it would exist only as balance sheets and anecdotes, and when money lost its story, it lost its discipline. Alice began to speak more deliberately in her final years. Not often, but intentionally. She told stories at moments when attention was genuine. She framed the past not as glory, but as burden. She emphasized risk, uncertainty, and the loneliness of decision-making. She wanted the younger Vanderbilts to understand that wealth had once been terrifying, that it had demanded courage, not comfort. Some listened with curiosity, a few with respect, most with polite distance. Alice did not blame them. You cannot feel fear secondhand. As the decade progressed, signs of strain appeared, not within the family alone, but across the world. Markets fluctuated, inequality sharpened, confidence grew brittle. Alice sensed approaching instability. She did not know its shape or scale, but she knew that long periods of comfort often ended abruptly. History. She had learned, moved in cycles that ignored personal readiness. She wondered how the Vanderbilts would respond when certainty cracked. Would they adapt? Would they retreat? Would they even recognize what was happening? She would not live long enough to see the full answer, but she understood her position now with clarity. She was not the architect of the future. She was the final custodian of the past, and as the last generation that truly remembered began to fade, Alice knew that something irreplaceable was leaving with them. Not the money, not the properties, but the knowledge of what it had cost to create it all. When that knowledge disappeared, wealth would still exist, but it would no longer know itself. As the 1920s unfolded, The world began moving faster than the Vanderbilt family. For the first time in nearly a century, history was no longer pausing to accommodate them. New industries reshaped the economy with breathtaking speed. Automobiles, oil, radio, motion pictures, and finance produced fortunes in years, not decades. Men whose names had meant nothing a generation earlier now commanded influence that rivaled or surpassed the old dynasties. Power was accelerating, and acceleration favored agility, not inheritance. Alice Clay Vanderbilt observed this shift with a clarity sharpened by age. She did not romanticize the past, but she recognized the pattern. When the world changed its rules, those who relied on precedent struggled to respond. The Vanderbilt fortune was stable, but stability was no longer synonymous with leadership. Once, controlling railroads meant controlling the future. Now, railroads were infrastructure, necessary, but unremarkable. The frontier of innovation had moved elsewhere, and the family had not followed it. Not because they were incapable, because they were comfortable. Alice noticed how conversations changed. Where once business decisions had dominated family discussions, now they appeared as background concerns. Advisors reported, managers summarized. The family listened politely and moved on. Ownership had become passive. The Vanderbilts still had wealth, but they no longer directed it. Their influence lingered, but it no longer shaped the next horizon. Others were taking risks, redefining markets, rewriting the rules, and the world rewarded them. Alice felt no jealousy. She felt recognition. This was what happened when power detached from participation, when stewardship became administration, when fortune became artifact rather than instrument. The family's response was subtle. They invested conservatively. They diversified cautiously. They protected capital. These were rational decisions, but they were defensive, not generative. The Vanderbilts had become guardians of the past, not architects of the future. Alice worried about what would happen when defense was no longer enough. She sensed that the era's confidence was fragile. Markets soared. Speculation intensified. Money moved faster than value. Optimism hardened into assumption. She had lived long enough to distrust assumption. History, she knew, punished certainty in private moments. Alice reflected on timing. The family had risen at precisely the right moment, when infrastructure mattered more than imagination, when consolidation beat innovation, when scale created inevitability. But the moment had shifted. The future now favored adaptability over dominance, creativity over control. The Vanderbilts had mastered the old game and stopped playing just as the rules changed. Alice felt a quiet sadness in this realization, not because decline was imminent, but because relevance was slipping gently out of reach. And relevance, once lost, rarely returned. Within the family, few seemed alarmed. Why would they be? Life was still comfortable. The name still carried weight. The houses still stood. The dividends still arrived. Change, when it arrived without pain, felt optional. Alice knew better. She had seen how eras ended, not with catastrophe, but with misalignment. The world moved one way, institutions moved another. The gap widened slowly, invisibly, until correction became unavoidable. She sensed that a reckoning was approaching, not specifically for the Vanderbilts, but for the assumptions that had governed an entire age. She would not live long enough to see its full impact, but she could feel it in the air. The world was impatient, capital was restless, certainty was overstretched. As Alice Clay Vanderbilt entered the final chapter of her life, she understood that her family stood at a threshold they did not recognize. They were still powerful, but no longer central, still wealthy, but no longer defining, still admired, but no longer unquestioned. And history, she knew, never waited for those who assumed it would. It moved on, quietly at first. Then, all at once, by the late 1920s, the world had begun to feel unsteady, not in obvious ways, but in tone. Confidence had grown loud. Certainty had become fashionable. Wealth moved with a speed that felt detached from labor. Production, or restraint. Gains were expected, not questioned. Risk was reframed as opportunity, and opportunity as entitlement. Alice Clay Vanderbilt recognized the sound immediately. She had heard it before, not in markets, but in people. It was the sound of momentum outrunning understanding. From the quiet rooms of her later life, Alice watched as the family navigated this new atmosphere with composure, but little curiosity. They were not reckless. They were not speculative. They remained, as ever, insulated, but insulation had consequences. When the world accelerated, insulation created lag. When assumptions shifted, insulation delayed recognition. The family, once hyper-attuned to change, now encountered it indirectly through advisors, summaries, filtered reports. Reality arrived softened. Alice worried about this more than she worried about loss. Loss could be felt. Lag could not. The Vanderbilt fortune was still large, but its influence was increasingly historical rather than directional. Others now defined what progress looked like. Others took the risks that reshaped society. The family watched, interested, distant, secure. Alice thought often of the concept of center. Once, the Vanderbilts had been a center of gravity. Markets bent toward them. Society calibrated itself around their presence. Now, that center had dispersed. Power was plural, influence decentralized. This was not failure. It was a change in physics. But families that rose through concentration rarely adapted easily to diffusion. The habits that preserved dominance became liabilities in a world that rewarded speed, experimentation, and reinvention. Alice saw how this affected identity. The younger Vanderbilts no longer spoke of shaping the world. They spoke of navigating it, of preserving lifestyle, of managing exposure. Their ambitions were inward-facing, calibrated to comfort rather than impact. This was understandable, but it was also final. A family that ceased to imagine itself as a force in history would eventually become a footnote, still rich, still visible, but no longer essential. Alice felt no anger toward this outcome. She believed history had seasons. Empires rose to answer specific needs. When those needs changed, the empires faded, not as punishment, but as consequence. The Vanderbilt fortune had served its era. It had built infrastructure, accelerated commerce, reshaped cities. It did not need to last forever. What troubled her was not the loss of dominance, but the absence of awareness. The family lived as if relevance were permanent, as if legacy were self-sustaining, as if wealth, once accumulated, carried its own justification indefinitely. Alice knew better. She had lived long enough to see how quickly certainty unraveled when the world demanded something new. As she approached the end of her life, Alice became increasingly quiet, not withdrawn, but selective. She conserved her words. She spoke only when meaning was possible. When asked about the family's future, she did not predict. She reflected. She spoke of attention, of responsibility, of the difference between possession and purpose. She reminded them that wealth was not a shield against history. That money could delay reckoning, but never cancel it. That relevance was earned repeatedly, not inherited once. Some listened. Many smiled politely. Alice did not insist. She understood that each generation learned in its own way, and often only after the lesson was unavoidable. In her final years, Alice Clay Vanderbilt carried no illusions. She knew the Vanderbilt name would endure, but differently. It would survive as architecture, as philanthropy, as memory. It would echo in museums and streets, in institutions and histories, but it would no longer command the future. And that, she believed, was as it should be. Power that lingered too long corrupted its holders. Influence that never faded prevented renewal. History needed circulation as much as continuity. As Alice's life drew quietly to a close, she understood her role with rare clarity. She had not been the builder. She had not been the destroyer. She had been the witness, the one who saw the rise from inside, the one who recognized the plateau, the one who sensed the drift before it became visible. And in that witnessing, she had preserved something no fortune could guarantee. Truth. Truth about how power feels when it grows. Truth about how comfort dulls vigilance. Truth about how legacies end, not with collapse, but with forgetting. When Alice Clay Vanderbilt was gone, the family would continue.